Russia, the world's third largest oil producer, is now importing gasoline, all thanks to Ukraine's sanctions.
For the past 2 months or so, Ukraine has been targeting these refineries with long-range drones.
President Zelensky has called striking oil refineries and depots the most effective sanctions. As a result, there have been fuel shortages and price hikes in some part of the country.
All this is putting extra pressure on the Kremlin's budget.
The combination of Russia's aging refineries, heavy sanctions blocking essential foreign equipment, and relentless waves of Ukrainian drone attacks has shattered Russia's ability to produce its own fuel. It's hard to imagine that a country sitting on oceans of oil could ever face empty gas stations. But that's exactly what's happening right now. Everyday Russians are now forced to pay up to 50% more for gasoline. And even then, they're left crossing their fingers, hoping that their local pump hasn't run dry yet. But how is this even possible for Russia, an oil superpower, to suddenly find itself out of gas? You see, there's a difference between simply pumping crude oil out of the ground and actually turning it into usable fuel like gasoline or diesel. When oil is first extracted, it's essentially a raw mixture of hydrocarbons, a thick, unusable liquid. Before it can fill the tank or a car or fuel an airplane, it needs to pass through specialized refineries. For example, in the US, a standard 42-gallon barrel of crude yields about 19 to 20 gallons of gasoline, another 11 to 13 gallons of diesel, and about 3 or 4 gallons of jet fuel. Roughly speaking, half the barrel ends up powering cars, a quarter fuels trucks and generators, and the rest is for aviation and other products. This is how crude works. It doesn't matter if Russia pumps 10 times or even 100 times more than anyone else, there's always a hard limit on how much oil their refineries can process each day. The real headache for Russia isn't a lack of refining capacity overall, but rather that they're putting all of their capacity into just a handful of huge plants, making themselves the perfect target, and Ukraine knows exactly how to hit where it hurts. To put this into perspective, Russia has around 30 major refineries, most of them clustered in the densely populated western parts of the country, or strategically placed along key export routes. These plants are fed by massive pipelines, carrying crude oil thousands of kilometers, all the way from the oil fields in Siberia. As of last month, about 38% of Russia's refining capacity, equivalent to nearly 338,000 tons per day, was offline. This was the highest shutdown rate on record, surpassing the previous high of 23% in August. This collapse led to roughly 400,000 tons of missing fuel each month, around 1/5 of the entire nation's consumption. So yeah, Russia might be swimming in crude oil, and sure, their export numbers might look incredibly high, but none of that matters if ordinary Russians can't even fuel their cars. Gas stations are running dry, not because Russia is short on oil, but because it simply doesn't have enough working refineries left to turn that oil into anything remotely useful. Ukraine knows exactly how much Russia depends on oil, and they also know that facing Russia's enormous military head-on would be suicide. No matter how sloppy or outdated Russian tactics may seem, Ukraine simply doesn't have enough soldiers or firepower to win in a direct traditional battle, so they've adapted. Since early 2024, rather than only hitting tanks or military bases, Ukraine has started going after refineries and fuel depots, the lifeblood of Russia's war machine. In 2024 alone, Ukrainian forces launched at least 81 attacks on Russian oil refineries, fuel storage depots, and related infrastructure across Russia, Crimea, and occupied Ukrainian territories. And the campaign intensified even further this year, with 21 out of Russia's 38 major refineries suffering direct hits. To put that into perspective, on paper, Russia has the capacity to refine around 327 million tons of crude oil every year, about 6.5 million barrels daily. But the 16 refineries struck in just August and September of 2025 accounted for about 123 million tons of annual capacity, 38% of Russia's entire refining power. Yeah, nearly 40% gone. And it'll take months for these facilities to be functional again. For instance, on September 5th, Ukrainian drones targeted Rosneft's huge Ryazan refinery, one of the top 5 facilities in Russia, located just 200 kilometers southeast of Moscow. This refinery alone produces nearly 18 million tons of fuel every year, supplying gasoline and diesel directly to the capital region and central Russia. Shortly after, Ukraine hit the Novokubishevsk refinery in the Samara region. This refinery is crucial because it processes oil flowing from Siberian fields into refined fuel products distributed across southern Russia. Losing Novokubishevsk disrupted fuel availability not only locally, but for large parts of southern and central regions that rely on its output. Days later, Astrakhan's refinery near the Caspian Sea and key export routes was also attacked, knocking out another vital production point that kept fuel flowing towards southern Russian cities and ports. Then, on September 14th, a drone was intercepted over the Kirishi refinery near St. Petersburg. But instead of protecting the plant, the wreckage plunged straight down onto the facility, igniting a massive fire. Kirishi is Russia's second largest refinery. It processes around 20 million tons of oil per year, supplying essential fuel not only to Russia's northwestern regions, but also exporting refined products abroad. And just a few hours into writing this script, Ukraine struck the same facility once again. The September attack had already cut the refinery's output by half. This latest hit might just finish the job entirely. With every successful strike, Russia's fuel output spiraled further downward. Gasoline and diesel production plummeted, forcing Putin deeper into a corner he never imagined he'd be in. At this stage, he has no choice but to squeeze every last drop from older, outdated refineries, forcing them to run far beyond their safe limits. Maintenance keeps getting postponed, breakdowns are becoming inevitable, and accidents are just waiting to happen. In some cases, even fuel tankers rushing emergency supplies across Russia were hunted down and targeted by Ukrainian drones. Ukraine's drone campaign is not only advanced, it's highly sophisticated, methodical, and devastatingly strategic. Kyiv's general staff confirmed in mid-August that nearly half, about 42%, of their long-range drone strikes since January have been focused on Russia's oil refineries. Besides the higher-profile hits on major facilities like Ryazan and Kirishi, Ukrainian drones also severely damaged critical plants in Saratov, Samara, Volgograd, and Astrakhan. In August alone, gasoline and diesel production capacity dropped by 6%, and in September it plunged by another 18%. By the end of September, Ukrainian drones had effectively wiped out roughly a quarter of Russia's entire refining capability. That's about 236,000 tons per day of lost fuel. In fact, 4 out of Russia's 5 largest refineries are currently offline. But Russia's nightmare doesn't just stop with the damage itself. Repairing these critical plants isn't as simple as patching holes or just replacing parts. Western sanctions have completely cut off access to specialized catalysts, advanced control software, and critical safety equipment that Russian refineries depend on. For decades, industry leaders like UOP and ABB supplied the sophisticated technology Russia needs to keep its top refineries operational. But since the invasion, they've completely halted shipments. Trying to source these specialized parts through other countries hasn't really worked either. It's like trying to fix a German luxury car with spare parts from an old Soviet-era Lada. Repairs that used to take weeks are now stretching into months, possibly even a year. And the longer this war drags on, the higher the chances these refineries will never return to their original capacity ever again. Right now, the combination of drone strikes and harsh sanctions is responsible for 70% of Russia's gasoline production shutdowns. Because other plants have to pick up the slack and push themselves beyond safe limits, the risk of accidents has skyrocketed. Recent fires at the Yaroslavl oil refinery and the Sokoldanaya pumping station clearly show just how fragile and vulnerable Russia's fuel network has become. Apart from all of these issues, there's one more critical problem making things even worse. Retail owners are simply shutting down their fuel stations altogether. Today, at least 10 major regions, places like Ryazan, Nizhny, Novgorod, Saratov, Rostov, Leningrad Oblast, and territories as far away as Primorsky and Zabakalsky, are facing extreme shortages. In many places, fuel deliveries have stopped altogether. Stations still operating have imposed strict limits, banning refills into canisters and often requiring local government approval for even small fuel purchases. Russian drivers are waiting in miles-long lines just to get enough gasoline to reach the next fuel station, hoping it isn't dry too. Things are even worse in Russia's Far East, where regional governments have been forced into introducing a coupon-based rationing system just to distribute limited fuel supplies. But Crimea might be suffering the most. Over half of the peninsula's gas stations have shut down for weeks now, and the reason is simple economics. The wholesale price of fuel they receive is usually higher than the retail price they're legally allowed to charge. What sane person would operate a business like that? It's literally cheaper and easier to just shut the pumps off entirely. And for those brave, or perhaps desperate enough to stay open, running a gas station has become a logistical nightmare. Tanker deliveries are often delayed by 2 or 3 months, and station owners have to pay full price up front to even get fuel dispatched, which completely drains their working capital. And the worst part is, if a tanker is struck by a Ukrainian drone en route, the station owner ends up bearing the entire loss. With stakes this high and profits this thin, it's no wonder that at least 300 independent fuel retailers across Russia have closed their doors since May. Perhaps the biggest strategic win for Ukraine in all of this is that Russian soldiers themselves have to wait at fuel stations rather than fighting battles at the front. Troops in Donetsk and Luhansk are often stuck in line for 2 or 3 hours just to refuel their military vehicles. Even then, they're given such small fuel rations that they frequently have to pay extra out of their own pockets. Melitopol, an absolutely critical logistics hub for Russian forces, hasn't received a single new fuel delivery since early September. And let me just emphasize how important Melitopol really is. The city sits directly at the intersection of 2 crucial highways, the E58 and the E105. Highway E58 connects Crimea to Russia's southern front lines, acting as a vital supply artery for troops fighting around Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk. Highway E105, meanwhile, is Russia's main north-south route from Crimea to the mainland, essential for transporting troops, heavy equipment, ammunition, and supplies. Losing reliable access to fuel here doesn't just mean inconvenience, it directly weakens Russia's combat effectiveness across the entire southern front. Despite Russia's ban on gasoline exports since 2024, the fuel shortage has only gotten worse month after month. By now, the export ban is practically meaningless. Russian refineries are so badly damaged and overstretched, they can't even meet their own domestic needs. Forget about shipping fuel abroad. So now, Russia has no choice but to start importing gasoline from countries like China, Singapore, South Korea, and Belarus. In fact, Russia is so desperate that it's even waived the 5% import duty it usually charges on fuel from China, South Korea, and Singapore, just to speed up deliveries. But that's not even the worst part, because gasoline is around 50% more expensive on global markets compared to what ordinary Russians pay at the pump. The Russian government has to step in and cover this massive price difference from its own product. And we're not talking about small change here. This gap in fuel prices represents billions of dollars Russia must spend just to keep fuel affordable for regular citizens. To put this into perspective, in the first 5 months of 2025 alone, Russians consumed around 16 million metric tons of gasoline. At that rate, Russia's gasoline consumption for the whole year could easily hit around 38 to 40 million tons. Even if Russia tries to import just a modest fraction of this, let's say 15%, that's around 6 million metric tons for the entire year. Converting that volume to liters, it equals roughly 7.8 billion liters of gasoline. With wholesale gasoline prices on the global market currently hovering between 80 and 90 cents per liter, importing that much gasoline could easily cost Russia anywhere from $6.2 to $7 billion every year. And since Russia has committed itself to subsidizing around half of that cost to keep gas stations affordable for ordinary Russians, the Kremlin is effectively forced to spend an extra $3 to $3.5 billion annually just to keep fuel available. To make things even more difficult, only 3 approved companies, Rosneft, Independent Oil and Gas Company, and the state-owned trade enterprise VO Pромsorimport, are now allowed to import fuel from countries willing to rescue Moscow from this crisis. Of course, Belarus was first in line to help. Since July, Russia's gas imports from Belarus have jumped by 36% compared to the previous year. By September, imports surged even higher, increasing by an astonishing 168% month-on-month. Yet, despite Belarus's pushing itself to the limit, demand still massively outweighs supply. Worse, Belarus itself is struggling with its own fuel shortages. But President Alexander Lukashenko would rather let his own citizens suffer than risk upsetting Vladimir Putin by refusing to help. The problem is, Belarus isn't exactly a gasoline giant. Its refineries only produce about 3 to 4 million tons per year, with nearly half consumed domestically. Lukashenko might squeeze out around 150,000 tons per month for Russia, but that's barely a fraction of what Russia needs. And yet Belarus would still let its own people endure shortages. All this just because Belarus desperately needs Russia's support for a new nuclear power plant in eastern Belarus. Putin has publicly endorsed the project, locking both countries into a deal neither can easily abandon. But consider the desperation involved here. For just a few 100,000 tons of gasoline, Russia could end up paying the entire $11 billion cost of a nuclear plant Belarus can't afford on its own. But even with these promises, there's no guarantee that Russia can keep paying. Years of relentless war spending have overheated Russia's economy and drained public finances dry. As of 2025, military expenses now devour an unbelievable 41% of Russia's entire government budget, the highest level since the peak of the Cold War. Gasoline prices have doubled at home, inflation is stuck at around 10%, and Russia's central bank is trapped between 2 impossible tasks: cutting interest rates to prevent recession or raising them to curb runaway prices. Russia is now trapped in a vicious cycle. War destroys refineries, fuel shortages drive inflation upward, and policy decisions designed to fight inflation slow economic growth. And slowing growth undermines the budgets desperately needed to repair and stabilize the collapsing infrastructure. Beyond all these statistics and political debates, this gasoline crisis is hitting ordinary Russians hard on a deeply personal level. Imagine losing hours every week, stuck in endless queues at gas stations, uncertain whether you'll be able to get enough fuel to reach home or work. Taxi drivers are watching helplessly as their earnings shrink by the day, with black market gasoline prices skyrocketing beyond what most can afford. In the countryside, families are terrified that fuel rationing might prevent them from heating their homes when the winter arrives. Farmers worry that without enough fuel, they won't be able to operate tractors and harvesters, threatening food production in a nation already struggling with inflation and economic uncertainty. Every one of these issues is piling onto an already strained economy, pushing Russia closer and closer to a breaking point. And Ukraine might finally be achieving something it struggled to accomplish over the past 3 years, turning the Russian public against their own leadership. Instead of controversial attacks on civilian apartments or other targets, Ukraine's strategic gamble of attacking Russia's fuel infrastructure has begun to pay off spectacularly. Slowly but surely, public resentment is boiling over. Recently, members of the Russian Communist Party organized protests at major gas stations, demanding to know why their oil-rich nation can't provide fuel for its own citizens. Social media is flooded with stories of black market dealers selling fuel coupons at outrageous prices, fueling anger not only against profiteers but against a government seemingly powerless to solve the crisis. And it's not like Russia knows what it's doing. Historically, Russia hasn't imported significant amounts of gasoline since the chaotic collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. This is a crisis that most Russians have never seen in their lifetime, something that was supposed to be left behind decades ago. So importing will bring a whole new set of problems and sanctions. In fact, apart from Ukraine's drone attacks, sanctions from the West have had an equally powerful impact on this fuel crisis. On one hand, Ukraine is smashing whatever infrastructure still works, and on the other, sanctions are actually preventing Russia from putting the pieces back together. Take Venezuela, for example. Despite sitting atop the world's largest proven oil reserves, the country faced crippling gasoline shortages because mismanagement and international sanctions made refinery repairs nearly impossible. Even Iran, another oil-rich country, at times had to import gasoline, despite exporting massive quantities of crude oil. Sanctions aren't just an inconvenience, they're powerful enough to cripple entire energy systems. Credit where it's due, Putin's government was smart enough, perhaps out of fear, to cap retail prices, even at the risk of huge losses. He learned from Russia's neighbors Kazakhstan, where in January of 2022, a sudden spike in liquefied petroleum gas prices ignited nationwide protests. Government buildings went up in flames, security forces opened fire on demonstrators, and it took Russian troops intervening directly to restore order. Putin knows all too well what fuel shortages can trigger, and he's desperate enough to avoid the same scenario unfolding in Russia. Yet, as long as this war drags on, and Ukraine does maintain their ability to strike deep inside of Russian territory, the cycle of damage will likely outpace Russia's capacity to repair. Some analysts now believe Ukraine is producing drones faster than Russia can fix its damaged refineries. Looking forward, even if Russia eventually manages to rebuild or diversify its fuel supply chains, the reputational damage is already done. For ordinary Russians, the daily struggle at gas stations is a constant reminder of how disastrously this war has turned their country's greatest strengths into its most glaring vulnerabilities.